Good morning. Thanks for being here. So what I would like to talk about this morning is a study that's been conducted, a long-term rotation study at Bow Island, which I've been sort of associated. It's basically run by Alberta Ag, Doon Polly, Alan Milton, and Ross McKenzie. And it's been running for 24 years. And what have we learned from it? And as I put this together, I realized I really can't give you too many of the lessons, but I'll give you a few that I thought were most interesting. So just, where is Bow Island? Way down there in the brown soil zone. The only long-term crop rotation down in Alberta, that is down in that area. And the other thing to notice is that it's a dryland cropping rotation, but it's right at the interface. You can see on the right the wheat fallow strips, that's dryland, and then you see all these circles, that's irrigated. And so we're right at the sort of intersection between those two systems that are down there. So you can see this is a nice, very flat area. It was initially broken from native prairie about 1920. From the 20s to the 60s, it was probably in a sort of typical fallow wheat rotation. In the 70s and 80s, it was actually under irrigation, so primarily in cereals. So it's not been a total dryland cropping rotation the whole history. Alberta Ag took it over. They had 1 year where they had it unfertilized, no irrigation, and then from 1992 to 2015, we've been conducting this long-term rotation study. And in this rotation study, we've got the standard fallow wheat rotation. We've got continuous wheat. They set up some with a continuous grass, which is harvested for hay. We've got a fallow crop. It started out fallow wheat, and then it became a fallow winter wheat lentil. We've got a fallow oilseed wheat, and the oilseed has been either flax or mustard. And then we have a pulse legume wheat. It started out as a green manure, and then it became a pea wheat rotation for many years, and then in the last few years it became a lentil wheat. Within each of these cropping systems, we've got different fertility systems. So we have all the phases, but we also have different fertility from unfertilized, and only in the fallow wheat and the wheat do we have all of these with unfertilized, just phos, just nitrogen, a little bit of nitrogen and a little bit of phos. 40N NP is one that comes across the board, so 40 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year, 9 kilos phosphorus per hectare per year. And finally we have a compost treatment, and this treatment here with the legume wheat, the compost was actually phosphorus fertilizer for the first 12 years and been compost for the last 12 years. So what's been happening over this period? And what I've got here, quickly, just what's been happening with the weather, and the same with, I think Ben was telling you, in 2001, we had this extreme drought. You'll see that in some of the data coming ahead. We have some dry years up here. We've got some very good moisture years here, similar to what's there. What I'm showing in this year is what's the grain yield over those 24 years. And the average is a nice even 4 metric tons per hectare per year. But remember, this is fallow wheat, so this is always the wheat year in the fallow rotation. And again, we can clearly see those dry years, but other than that, it's been actually a very good period for stable yields. If we look at, for example, where the continuous wheat, this is every year, so so the average here is about 2.5 tons per hectare per year. Here, when we get dry years, you get really hammered, so we're a little bit more variable. But again, we've, especially over the last 12, 14 years, again, very stable yields. And we look at the relationship between the two. On average, the yield in the continuous wheat rotation is about 60% of what we get in the fallow wheat. And since you're growing it every year, you actually have a yield benefit of 20% more production off of continuous wheat than in the fallow wheat. And again, sometimes it's as good, sometimes it's like almost nothing in the continuous wheat. And well, how do these two different systems, how have they been responding to nitrogen? And what I've done in this one here first is, what I'm representing here is if you don't apply nitrogen, how much did you lose in yield? And you can see you almost always lose something. Over that whole period in the fallow wheat rotation, you're losing an average of 0.4 tons per hectare, or about 10%. And that's excluding that 1 year there. In the continuous wheat, we're losing on average 1 ton per hectare, or 37%. And so one of the things we can tell from that is that our continuous wheat system, same rate of nitrogen, but is much more nitrogen deficient, which of course makes sense because we're cropping it every year, we're building up some soil organic matter, some of the same type of things that I think is happening in Ben's study. You also see that same thing here. The protein in the fallow wheat is almost always much higher than in our continuous wheat. So again, our same rates, but one system is actually much more deficient than the other. In contrast, if we look at something like how has this system's been responding to phosphorus over those 24 years, on average, only a 5% loss in our fallow wheat and a very similar 4% loss in our continuous wheat rotation. And they jump around a bit, but again, it's been fairly consistent and generally small, but still there. The other thing I wanted to talk a bit about was, well, how has this been influenced in this pulse legume thing? So we're looking at the pulse here, the wheat, or the pea versus the wheat, and then what's the benefit of that subsequent? And here you can kind of look at, this is from 1999, unfertilized wheat following wheat, and versus following pea, also unfertilized, and you can see that there probably was quite a large benefit of the previous pea on the nitrogen. And what I'm showing here is basically, well, first was the pea yields, so we're getting that pea every other year. First we didn't because we were green manure, and then we decided, well, all the farmers in the area said, we don't want to get yield every year, so this is what we want to look at. So we started harvesting it, and over this whole period, we got an average of 1.7 tons per hectare. But it's a very tight rotation, and we're starting to have real disease problems, which is why they substituted lentil for the pea, at least to get at least some diversification. And here what I'm going to look at is the wheat benefit of the wheat grown on the pulse thing, but note here, this is the unfertilized compared to my fertilized. So basically what I'm saying here is anytime this is over the line, that legume crop is providing the equivalent of at least 40 kilos of nitrogen equivalency, and most years it's more. So when we're green manuring, we're very consistently getting more than a 40 kilo bent. Then we switched over and we started harvesting. Even though you say, what's happening here, it's much lower than here, but we're still on average getting as much yield in our unfertilized as we are with 40 kilos of N in our continuous cropping thing. Except for this, okay, but wait a minute, this is the following that drought year where we basically had no pea crop. On average over this whole period, we have on average about, compared to fertilized, of 2% or of an 11% yield benefit in our lentil compared to a fertilized wheat. We also, one of the benefits of long-term things is things always happen. Well, what happened here was that when they started putting on the lentil, they accidentally put the lentil on the pea and the wheat. So what we had here was, this here is actually a wheat on wheat. And so the both exceptions here are basically sort of saying that that benefit of that pulse crop in rotation is probably pretty short. Like if you don't have one, doesn't work. And here is basically a second year of wheat, and again, we're not seeing the same kind of benefit. So we're probably looking mostly at the year after effect. What about if we add phosphorus or compost in there? And again, our yield in the pea is just about the same, so we're still getting pretty good pea yields off of that. And one of the very interesting things was that over this, again, this last period, over previous, it's about the same as without any phosphorus fertilizer. With it, we've got an average of 28% benefit for that wheat growing in that P rotation with some compost compared to a fertilized, you know, albeit at a moderate rate, 40 kilos of N per hectare, 28% yield benefit just following that P with a bit of compost. And you say, well, maybe that's all due to the compost. Well, here's the, again, the compost treatment in the continuous wheat compared in the fallow wheat rotation, and you can see, oh, well, it's not, but again, I'm comparing it to fertilized. And basically, compost is a great source of phosphorus and potassium. You'll see that a bit later, but it's not providing the nitrogen that you need. And so, and in the continuous wheat, we even got more negative effects. So basically, in our legume, it's the legume that's really providing most of the benefit, but for some reason, there's this extra benefit of having both. And on average, but there's still some benefit. There's a 11% yield benefit in that compost compared to absolutely no fertility. But just compost by itself does not replace Just get one way of looking at, well, why are we getting some of these effects? I did some sampling in just this past fall of just a few of the treatments. We're measuring it with the PRS probes, and so we're just basically measuring the ability of the soil to supply nitrogen to an ion exchange membrane. And a few things to note in our treatments here is that legume in rotation certainly has a much higher nitrogen supply rate than any of the other treatments. And the other thing to note is that, well, if you don't fertilize for 24 years, now we're really starting to get lower. But these numbers here are actually especially those are extremely high. 5 is maybe is marginal. You'll start to expect a bit of yield benefit from addition of phosphorus fertilizer. So basically, our phosphorus fertilizer at these rates is probably being as high, or it's actually more than enough to build up some phosphorus. We look at our potassium. Again, we have a lot of potassium and phosphorus, and so in our pulse wheat rotation, basically we've got this extra nitrogen as well as some extra phosphorus as well as a high, and all of those may be working together. The other thing that we kind of see is that over those 24 years, our pHs are starting to really go down due to the nitrogen fertilizer. Our composts are keeping that up, and so there's this pH change that is affecting, which, you know, maybe not in the range yet where it's affecting things, but in the long run it might be something that also has an impact of how you're fertilizing over the long term. So lessons one of the things, you know, like, why did they use only 40 kilos N per hectare per year? And basically at the time when they started, that was kind of like what they thought was all that was required in those brown soil system. But we can kind of see that, and we know that now, is that we actually could use much higher N rates. So that was one thing we kind of for sure learned from this 24 years. The other thing was, what I thought even more interesting, of course, is the synergy of the pulse crops and the compost to give really a large benefit for that wheat in the rotation. What I didn't get into is some things like the other things, but for example, that grass in this rotation has a huge increase in organic matter. We see some differences between our fallow wheat and our continuous wheat, and we're at the end of the 24 years, and the plan right now is to actually discontinue the actual rotation, but going into do a monitoring phase where we plant the same crop over the whole plot for a number of years, depending on how much funding we could potentially get for it, and look at what's those long-term benefits of having, you know, like if you go onto a fallow wheat land, or if you go onto a continuous wheat, or how long will those pulse crops or those grass effects last? And so that's where we're hoping to go next, providing the funding comes through. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the Alberta Ag Field Crew who've been keeping these things going over the years.